March 6, 1944, over Germany. At 23,000 feet above Nazi Germany, a formation of American B-17 flying fortresses thundered through the frozen air. Among them was one bomber whose tail gunner, Staff Sergeant Michael Donovan, was about to make history, as 12 Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters appeared in the distance. The crew braced for the inevitable attack. Standard procedure was simple: wait, conserve ammunition, and fire defensively. But Donovan had a different plan. He had watched too many bombers be torn apart by German fighters waiting for the right moment. So, instead of following orders, he decided to break every rule in the book. The decision: when the first Bf 109 seconds lined up for attack, Donovan swung his twin .50 caliber machine guns forward and opened fire at maximum range. It was a suicidal move. At that distance, hitting anything seemed impossible, and revealing his position early would make his bomber an easy target. But Donovan's relentless burst threw the German pilots into chaos. His tracer round sliced through the sky, forcing them to break formation. Confusion spread instantly. 4 minutes of fury. As the Luftwaffe pilots tried to regroup, Donovan shifted targets with deadly precision. One fighter burst into flames, then another. Within 4 minutes, 12 German Bf 109 seconds had been destroyed or forced to disengage. Donovan's madness turned out to be tactical genius. His early, aggressive fire disrupted the enemy's attack pattern, saving not only his bomber but several others in the formation. Aftermath: when the B-17 limped back to base, riddled with holes, Donovan's commanding officers expected a report of total loss. Instead, they found a gunner who had rewritten the rules of air combat. His actions proved that aggression and initiative could sometimes outweigh defensive tactics, a lesson that changed how bomber crews would engage enemy fighters for the rest of the war. Legacy: Michael Donovan's story became a legend among bomber crews. A man who ignored orders, risked everything, and turned a hopeless defense into a stunning victory. One gunner, one suicidal decision, and a moment that changed air warfare forever. England, March 6, 1944. The battered B-17, flying fortress, Iron Maiden, roared low over the English coast, its engines coughing smoke, one propeller barely spinning. Inside, the crew sat in shocked silence. The smell of burned gunpowder and oil filled the fuselage. They had survived. Against all odds, they were still alive. When the bomber touched down on the runway of RAF Bassingbourn, emergency trucks raced beside it. Mechanics and medics swarmed the plane, counting bullet holes like scars. More than 200 were later found along its body. The tail section, where Staff Sergeant Michael Donovan had made his stand, was almost shredded. Yet the gunner himself was there, face blackened, goggles cracked, hands trembling, sitting beside his twin .50 caliber Browning machine guns, their barrels glowing red from heat. They didn't get us. The debriefing. Hours later, Donovan and his crew stood before a row of senior officers in the mission debriefing room. The mood was tense. The official report described reckless engagement and failure to follow standard defensive procedures. One colonel slammed his hand on the desk. "Who gave you the order to fire at that range, Sergeant?" Donovan looked him in the eye. "No one, sir. I just saw them lining up and figured I'd make them think twice." The room fell silent. At first, command saw his action as a disciplinary problem. Breaking formation protocol was serious. But then, the reconnaissance photographs came in. They showed burning wreckage across German farmland near Bremen. 12 Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds confirmed down or destroyed within a few minutes of the engagement. No escort fighters had been near the formation at that time. The kills all matched the window of Donovan's lone attack. Shock and recognition. The intelligence officer couldn't believe it. A single tail gunner had done more damage than entire squadrons, sometimes managed in full engagements. The report spread through Bomber Command like wildfire. Gunners across England began talking about the crazy American who had defied orders and lived. They called him Mad Mike Donovan. To the brass, he was unpredictable. To the men flying daily through German flak, he was a hero, a symbol of raw courage and defiance, a new philosophy of air combat. Within weeks, Donovan's engagement was studied by the 8th Air Force Tactical Analysis Division. They found that his early, aggressive fire had disrupted the enemy's approach pattern, breaking their coordination and forcing them to attack individually instead of in synchronized waves. This revelation led to the birth of a new tactic, informally named the Donovan Defense. Crews were trained to open fire earlier than before, not necessarily to hit, but to disrupt, to break the rhythm of enemy formations, to take control of the fight before it even began. For the first time, bomber gunners were no longer told to wait and hope. They were told to fight back first. March 22, 1944 mission to Berlin. Dawn broke cold and gray over the English countryside. The airfield hummed with engines and tension. Mechanics shouted, loaders slammed belts of .50 caliber rounds into guns, and the smell of oil and gasoline hung thick in the fog. In the tail turret of the B-17, Iron Maiden, Staff Sergeant Michael Donovan sat quietly, running his gloved hand over the cool metal of his guns. 2 weeks earlier, he had become a legend. Now, he was a marked man at least. That's how it felt. The crew's orders were simple but deadly. Bomb Berlin, the heart of Hitler's war machine. But intelligence reports warned of something else. The Luftwaffe was preparing an ambush. Hundreds of fighters were expected to intercept the American bombers before they reached the city. It was a trap, and everyone knew it. The flight into the lion's den. At 26,000 feet, the sky turned blinding white with contrails. Hundreds of bombers stretched across the horizon, a fortress fleet of thunder. Below them, flak burst like black flowers in the air. Donovan scanned the skies behind with icy focus. 6 o'clock high. Contacts incoming, he called over the intercom. Through his gun sight, dark specks began to form and then multiply. Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, dozens of them. More than anyone had seen in weeks. The Luftwaffe was coming for revenge. The German counterattack. This time, the Germans came in waves. Instead of charging straight ahead, they used new tactics: coordinated dives, rolling climbs, and blind spots. They had studied Donovan's last battle. They were adapting. Tracer fire ripped past the tail. The entire bomber shuddered as rounds punched through its skin. Donovan swung his guns, firing bursts, his tracers cutting through the gray haze. 2 on the right. Break formation, he yelled. But there was nowhere to go. The bombers had to hold tight or risk losing the formation entirely. The first Bf-109 screamed past the tail. Donovan's rounds caught it in the belly. It exploded into a black cloud. But the others kept coming. The moment of truth. For a brief moment, time seemed to slow. Donovan saw a formation of 3 Bf-109 seconds lining up perfectly on the Iron Maiden's tail. He knew what was coming. Coordinated attack designed to overwhelm him. He could wait and fire defensively, or he could risk everything again. He chose the second option. He fired first. Tracer lines arced across the sky like streaks of fire. The lead 109 flinched, dove, and exploded. The second broke formation, slamming into its partner as both spiraled downward. But in that instant, another German fighter scored a direct hit on the B-17's tail. The impact threw Donovan against his gun sight. Metal tore apart. His headset went dead. Smoke filled the turret. He was wounded, shrapnel across his shoulder and face, but he kept firing. Not today, he muttered, blood running down his neck. Donovan's final mission. The last flight of the Iron Maiden. April 11, 1940 for England. The dawn mist rolled across the airfield like a ghostly sea. Engines roared, ground crews shouted, and the smell of fuel and steel filled the morning air. The B-17 Iron Maiden stood ready, once again patched with new metal, her wounds still visible from Berlin. Painted just beneath the cockpit was a fresh 19 black swastikas, marking the confirmed kills credited to her tail gunner, Staff Sergeant Michael Donovan. But Donovan himself was changed. His shoulder was still bandaged from shrapnel, his left ear half deaf from the blast over Berlin. The doctors told him to take leave. He refused. "As long as that plane flies, I fly," he said simply. This was his crew, his fortress, his sky. And deep down, he knew this mission might be his last. The target, Leipzig. Their orders were clear: a daylight bombing raid on Leipzig, a key industrial hub fueling the German war machine. The route was long, the defenses brutal. The Luftwaffe had grown desperate and deadly. The crew of the Iron Maiden knew the odds, but they trusted their gunner, the man who had turned impossible missions into survival stories. At 0700 hours, the Iron Maiden lifted off into the gray English sky. One more flight into the heart of darkness. The enemy awaits. Hours later, at 25,000 feet over central Germany, the bombers hit the flak zone. Black bursts tore through the sky, shaking the formation. The intercom crackled with tension. "Tail section, report." "Still here," Donovan replied. "They'll be coming soon." Moments later, the radar operator called it out. Multiple bogies inbound. 12 o'clock low, fast. Through his cracked goggles, Donovan saw them, a swarm of Focke-Wulf 190 seconds and Bf 109 seconds, climbing fast, more than 20 of them. This was no random patrol. It was an ambush. The Luftwaffe had come hunting for the Iron Maiden. The last stand. The first attack came in a coordinated wave. 3 German fighters slashed through the formation, their cannons flashing. A B-17 exploded in a burst of flame. The sky turned into chaos, trails of smoke, tracer lines, and dying engines. Donovan steadied his breath. "Come on, you bastards," he whispered. He waited until the enemy filled his sights and then unleashed hell. His twin Brownings thundered, the tracers glowing orange against the cold blue sky. A Focke-Wulf burst apart, then another. Rounds ripped into the Iron Maiden's tail. Metal screamed, and shards flew everywhere. Donovan felt hot pain in his leg, but he didn't stop. He kept firing, shouting through the intercom. Even as static drowned his voice. "Keep her steady. I've got him. Don't you dare dive." The gunners on the waist joined in. The entire bomber became a fortress of flame, but the enemy wouldn't break. The Germans circled for another attack, determined to bring down the legend who had humiliated them. The legend lives on, remembering Donovan and the Iron Maiden. England, May 1945. The war was over. The guns had fallen silent. Across Europe, cities lay in ruins, and millions of soldiers were heading home. Some walking, some carried, and some remembered only by name. At Raff Bassingbourn, the airfield where it all began, rows of bombers sat quietly in the mist, their engines cold, their mission finally done. Among them, one aircraft stood apart, a battered B-17 with faded paint, patched metal, and 19 small black swastikas under her cockpit. Her name, barely visible now, Iron Maiden. The end of war, the beginning of memory. Ground crews gathered around her one last time before decommission. The tail turret, once Donovan's throne and tomb, was still scorched from the fire that had claimed him. A mechanic reached out, brushing the metal with his glove. "He never left his post," the man whispered. "Not once." The base commander ordered that the Iron Maiden not be scrapped. Instead, she was towed to the edge of the airfield and left standing, a monument to every man who fought in the skies over Europe. For months after the war, new recruits and old veterans came to see her. They'd touch the bullet holes, trace the name Donovan carved faintly beneath the turret window, and remember, a legend among the clouds. Word of Michael Donovan spread far beyond England. To the airmen of the 8th Air Force, he became a symbol, the embodiment of courage and defiance. To the Germans who had fought him, he was a ghost, a gunner who refused to die, who turned hopeless missions into victory. American newspapers later wrote of the tail gunner who changed the war. But Donovan had never cared about fame. His story lived on because the men who flew with him refused to forget. They told his story in mess halls and at reunions, to their sons and grandsons, not as myth, but as truth. Of a man who stood alone at the back of a bomber, watching death approach through a glass window, and chose to fight anyway. The Donovan Defense. After the war, the U.S. Army Air Forces officially incorporated his long-range engagement tactic into air gunnery doctrine. It was renamed Aggressive Defensive Fire Protocol, but among the crews, it was still called the Donovan Defense. Pilots taught it to new generations, historians studied it, and in the skies of Korea and Vietnam, bomber crews still used his principle: fire first, disrupt, survive. Decades after his death, his influence was still protecting lives. A letter never sent. Years later, Donovan's family received a small box from the War Department. Inside were his medals, his flight wings, and a letter one he had written but never sent. It read, "If I don't come home, don't be sad. We all fight for each other up there. Not for glory, not for medals. When you're in the sky, there's no politics, no hate. Just the man next to you, and the hope you'll see tomorrow." Donovan's legacy in the jet age. Duxford, England, 1952. The war was long over. New engines now ruled the skies, sleek silver jets instead of thundering bombers. But in one quiet hangar at the Imperial War Museum, Duxford, an old relic of the past stood proudly beneath the skylight. A battered B-17, flying fortress with her name still painted faintly across the nose, Iron Maiden. Children pressed their faces to the glass. Old men stood silently, remembering. And carved into a bronze plaque below the tailgun turret were the words, "Staff Sergeant Michael Donovan, Tailgunner, U.S. 8th Air Force. He fought alone, so others could come home." The changing skies. By the 1950s, the world had entered the jet age. The roar of B-17s was replaced by the scream of jet engines. Young pilots trained for a new kind of war. Faster, higher, colder. Yet even in flight schools across the United States, instructors still spoke of one name. "Study the Donovan Defense," they'd say. "It's not about shooting first, it's about thinking faster." For gunners, it was no longer just a tactic. It was a philosophy. Take control of fear before fear controls you. The first tribute flight. In 1954, on the 10th anniversary of Donovan's last mission, the U.S. Air Force arranged a memorial flyover at Duxford. 3 B-17s, the last still airworthy, took to the skies once more, flying in formation above the old airfield where the Iron Maiden had once taken off. As they passed overhead, veterans saluted. The sound of the engines echoed through the countryside like ghosts returning home. Some swore they could almost see another plane in the distance. A fourth bomber flying just behind them, shimmering in the sunlight before fading away. "That's the Iron Maiden," one old pilot whispered. "She's still up there." Donovan's influence in future wars. When the Korean War broke out in the early 1950s, American bomber crews flying the B-29 Super Fortress used Donovan's engagement philosophy. They called it defensive aggression. Instead of waiting for MiG fighters to strike, crews would open fire, preemptively disrupting attacks before they could begin. Historians later traced that doctrine directly back to Donovan's original after-action report from 1944. One man's instinctive defiance had become global military strategy, and even in Vietnam, bomber crews carried manuals with the section titled Long-Range Defensive Fire Principles Donovan Model. His name became part of training. History, a permanent lesson etched into the mindset of airmen who would never meet him, but who lived because of what he taught. The visit. In 1961, an elderly mechanic named Tom Sparks Harper, one of Donovan's original ground crew, returned to Duxford for the first time since the war. He found the Iron Maiden behind velvet ropes, her paint faded, her wings coated in dust. The return of the Iron Maiden. Donovan's spirit takes flight again. Duxford, England, June 1994. It had been 50 years since the final mission of the Iron Maiden. Half a century since her guns went silent. The world had changed. New wars, new machines, new heroes, but in one quiet corner of the Duxford Museum, the old bomber still waited. Her aluminum skin had dulled with time. Dust had settled over her wings. Visitors passed by without realizing that the machine before them had once carried a legend. But that year, 1994, marked the 50th anniversary of D-Day, and a small group of veterans and aviation historians had a dream: to make the Iron Maiden fly again. The restoration begins. Under hangar lights, a new generation of mechanics, engineers, and historians gathered. Some were young, barely 20, the same age Donovan had been when he manned his guns. Others were veterans, their hands trembling but hearts steady. Piece by piece, they began to restore her. Rusted bolts were replaced. Damaged wings were reinforced. Old engines were removed, cleaned, and fitted with modern fuel lines. But the most delicate part of the restoration was the tail turret, Donovan's seat. It was found sealed shut, its glass cracked, and its gun mounts fused with rust. When the restorers opened it, they found something no one expected: a single, rusted, .50 caliber shell still chambered ready to fire. The team fell silent. No one touched it. They placed it in a glass case beside the aircraft, labeled simply, "The Last Round Tail Gunner M. Donovan." April 1944. The day of the flight. June 6, 1994. 50 years to the day after D-Day. Crowds filled the airfield. Veterans in their 70s stood shoulder to shoulder, tears in their eyes. Among them was Tom Harper, Donovan's old ground mechanic, now 80 years old, watching with trembling hands. Engines roared to life, four deep, thunderous voices that shook the air. The Iron Maiden rolled slowly down the runway, her silver wings gleaming under the morning sun. And then, she lifted. For the first time in half a century, the Iron Maiden was flying again. The crowd erupted. But for many, the sound of those engines carried something more: the echo of ghosts, the memory of all who had never come home, the tribute in the sky. As she climbed into the clouds, a formation of modern jets joined her, F-15 Eagles of the U.S. Air Force. Side by side, the past and present flew together. The bomber that had defined courage, and the fighters that inherited her spirit. At 10,000 feet, the Iron Maiden's pilot spoke over the radio, his voice cracking, "This one's for you, Donovan." Then he banked the bomber gently over the English countryside, tracing a giant circle, a missing man formation, to honor all who never returned. The reunion. After landing, the veterans approached the plane. They touched her fuselage, whispering to each other, eyes wet. The legend beyond the sky. Arlington, Virginia. In a quiet corner of the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, a new exhibit was unveiled. Visitors gathered before a restored B-17 tail turret, its glass gleaming under soft light. Above it, a simple plaque read, "Staff Sergeant Michael Donovan, the gunner who changed the sky. Keep her steady. I've got 'em." Families stood in silence. Children looked up in awe. Few understood how one man's courage in 1944 could ripple across generations. But the story of Iron Maiden made them believe. The documentary that started it all. A young filmmaker from Ohio, Ethan Moore, 27, had stumbled across Donovan's name while researching forgotten Wii heroes. No medals, no official records beyond mission logs, just scattered mentions and fading photos. He decided to dig deeper. 2 years later, his documentary, Mad Mike, the tail gunner who fought alone, premiered on Netflix, and it shocked the world. Millions watched it. Viewers cried, stood in applause, shared his story across TikTok, YouTube, and social media. Hashtags like #IronMaidenLegend and #DonovanCourage began trending worldwide. For the first time in decades, the spirit of the Wii bomber crews, their bravery, fear, and sacrifice reached a new generation. A new generation takes flight. Inspired by the documentary, young pilots and aviation students began visiting the old bomber at airshows. Flight schools reported an increase in students citing the Donovan story as their reason for joining. Even in the U.S. Air Force Academy, new cadets learned his tactics, the Donovan defense, not just as military history, but as a mindset. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's action when no one else will move. In 2025, the Air Force officially honored him with the Distinguished Flying Cross, presented posthumously to his surviving family, 81 years after his final mission. When the medal was laid beneath his old turret, the crowd stood and saluted. The wind whispered through the hangar. Some said they could almost hear it, the faint hum of a B-17 engine, far above. The legacy in film and culture. Hollywood soon followed. A major film adaptation, Iron Maiden, The Last Gunner, was announced by Warner Bros., starring Austin Butler as Donovan. It promised to tell not just his story, but the untold lives of bomber crews who fought an impossible war in the freezing skies of Europe. The trailer alone gathered over 50 million views in 24 hours. Young audiences were captivated not by explosions or special effects, but by something timeless: honor, the spirit that never fades. Every year now, during D-Day commemorations, a restored B-17 flies over the beaches of Normandy. On her tail turret is painted the name Donovan, and when the engines roar to life, veterans, historians, and young dreamers alike look up, knowing that courage, once born, never truly dies.